Are you thinking of starting a telemedicine practice, or are you thinking of adding telemedicine to your practice? Either way, it's confusing and it keeps changing, usually for the better, but it's a lot to keep track of. And my guest today helps practices start and add telemedicine to their own practice, and he's going to give us a little bit of insight on it. I'm Carl White, principal at Mark Advisory Group, which is a healthcare marketing agency, and I'm also the host of PracticeCare. And the mission for both is the same, and that's to help private practice owners stay private. Not only is that what they want, but let's face it, if your doctor owns the place, your provider owns the place, they've got the most freedom they're going to have to make the clinical decisions that are best for you and to work with you on those, as opposed to when they work for somebody else and eventually their agenda creeps in. And we don't like that. We want you to stay private so that you can make good decisions for your patients. And my guest today is Scott Rattigan. Scott is a licensed attorney, business and mindset coach, integrative medicine practice consultant. His passion is helping integrative and functional medicine providers build and grow their practices to realize their goals and fall back in love with practicing medicine. He founded a company called Functional Lawyer to address the lack of legal support in the functional medicine practitioner community. It gives providers the tools to protect themselves and build solid legal and business foundations that allow them to grow with confidence, free from anxiety, and focus on change in the lives of their patients without exorbitant legal fees. Scott also hosts a podcast called the Junto Club, Junto, that focuses on the functional medicine practitioner, the mental side of entrepreneurship, financial management, marketing, legal business, and so much more. And you can follow Scott and all of his projects on scottrattigan.com. Scott, thanks for taking some time to come on PracticeCare.
My pleasure to be here.
So let's start where we start with a lot of guests. Just kind of fill in some more about your background. How did you get to where you are? You've told this to me before when we've talked, but it's a nice long and windy road, and it's interesting. And it's just, I think it's going to help people get to know you a bit better.
Yeah, I'll do my best to keep it shorter than long and windy. But yeah, so I came out of law school and started at a top 100 firm in Orlando, doing commercial litigation, so not healthcare initially. Mm-hmm. And my wife, who was a family medicine doctor, a DO, was a couple of years out of residency, burnt out, experiencing fatigue and all these vague symptoms herself. Mm-hmm. And then knew that as a primary care provider herself, knew that she needed something different than what PCPs could offer. Mm-hmm. Found functional medicine, called me from the first conference crying, like, I need to do this. So fast forward a year later, she started a practice. So our second child was 4 months old. And we started, and our first child was 2 years old. So we were busy. Wow. I was at the firm all day, and I'd come home and at night kind of plan it out at the kitchen table, as you do. Mm-hmm. And so everything from let's come up with a name, let's figure this out. And we quickly realized that, I wasn't equipped to handle all the healthcare regulation because I knew that there was a lot of it. Mm-hmm. So we went to a partner at my firm, healthcare partner, been there a long time, and paid him the retainer. And ultimately, he didn't know what to do with a single.
So you were still working there?
Yeah, I was at the firm.
I guess you still have to pay for it. Yeah, it's like, I pay the retainer. You sound like anybody off the street.
Yeah, and a naive young associate, like, you bring in business, and that kind of eventually leads you to a partnership level.
Right.
And ultimately, I didn't want that later on. But anyway, so I brought in this business. And he was, great attorney, no fault of his own, just didn't know what to do with a single doctor, cash practice, functional alternative medicine. Like, it wasn't a thing. Mm-hmm. That he was familiar with. And so we paid a couple $1,000s to him, to the firm, and ultimately walked away with not a lot of help. Mm. Fast forward another year later, I'm burnt out at commercial litigation, seeking to get with a smaller law firm, doing entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. Helping entrepreneurs, and a position came available at Evolution of Medicine. So I became a practice consultant there, essentially kind of selling their marketing program. Okay. For a year and a half. But in so doing, I got to talk to practitioners all day, every day. Mm-hmm. And once a few of them learned that I was an attorney, they were like, "Oh, can you help?" And I would say, "No, It's not really what I'm doing right now." But ultimately,
so you were not practicing law when you were with Evolution of Medicine?
Not actively, no. So I've always had my license, and I was kind of just, I could always go back,
Right.
It's a good fallback plan.
Right.
But yeah, so ultimately I was kind of just doing practitioner support and some sales, and discovered by talking to hundreds of doctors around the country that and other providers that there just was a need out there. People were getting documents off of the internet or writing their own, or worse, kind of doing a both,
Oh,
and not knowing where they got it from, or doing stuff that sounds good. And some of them weren't bad, but most of them were pretty bad.
okay.
So ultimately, I launched Functional Lawyer to kind of just be hey, these are just high quality, law firm quality templates that you can purchase and use and be more protected. So I partnered with a law firm, did a lot of self-study, continuing education on my own for healthcare law, and kind of launched that. I did free discovery calls where I would kind of point people towards their documents, but it ended up being an hour long, like me give you all the information I have in my head, and then you don't buy anything from me. And so
Gee,
that
thanks
wasn't
for
a
all that.
successful
Yeah.
way. Yeah.
You're
Wasn't a
welcome.
great way to
But
run a
yeah.
business. But the flip side of that, the positive end of that coin, was people were like, this has been so great. What happens if I have questions later? And so the light bulb went off, and I developed what we now call the membership, which is not the most creative name, but is great.
It's clear.
For so it's a lot of pre-recorded education for things I just repeat over and over again. It comes with every document I've got at Functional Lawyer, and we're always adding more as members request them. And then each week we do office hours, a Q&A with me, myself. And so as things arise in a practice, we can kind of help you get pointed in the right direction. So that's Functional Lawyer. At the same time, my wife's practice was growing, and she did a bunch of different business models and stumbled on, not stumbled on, but kind of like took a step back and looked at what was best for her patients, and ended up doing a membership model. Filled up from 0 to 100 in less than a year, members in her practice. And we didn't realize how insane that was. But then other doctors kept coming to me at Functional Lawyer saying, well, how does your wife do it? How is it? And they're like, well, what does she do? And I'm like, well, she works these hours and this is what she makes. And they're like, what? Can you teach us? So now for the past,
she's happy, and her patients are happy, and she finds stuff that the 7-minute appointment can't, and on and on and on, and everybody wins.
Yeah, has a life. The prices are reasonable, to be fair. Not kind of a person for concierge or elite medicine. And so we've been now consulting other practices for a good 5 years on that front. So that's kind of where all of your titles that you read off at the beginning all kind of came from.
Got it. Well, good. Thank you for that. And so let's get into telemedicine, and just kind of a clarifying question first. So those who you consult with, are they only in the functional medicine world, or if anybody called you up from wherever, you would talk to them?
So Functional Lawyer is largely applicable regardless of the discipline that you're using in medicine. Most of the laws are the same across the board.
Right.
Functional medicine is just kind of like a different layered approach to medicine.
Right.
And so, we'll get into it, but HIPAA applies across the board.
Right.
Most, standard of care applies across the board, your scope of practice, everything else. And so 99% of it applies. A couple of the patient agreements and then the consent for functional medicine are unique to functional or alternative medicine. And so it's named Functional Lawyer because that's who I was trying to attract, because that was the need in the marketplace that's needed to be filled. But, conventional providers could purchase templates if they wanted to. And
it would make sense. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good.
Particularly telehealth consent is standardized, and that's,
you would think,
required in every state.
Sure. And so I wanted to get that out there, because we're going to turn now. I want to ask you some questions about telemedicine and getting started. And I'm going to use your book. So Scott has literally written a book. It's called The Practice of Telemedicine. It came out recently. I've read it. It's as much of like a handbook and a playbook as a book, which I mean complimentary. For listeners who are thinking about getting in this, you need to get this, and we'll put the link to it in the show notes. But it's The Practice of Telemedicine, Scott's last name, Rattigan. You'll find it very easily. And so let's just kind of use the book to structure the questions. So the first section it starts very nicely, definition and myths. So let's just start right there. Give us the definition of telemedicine we should all be working with. And of all the myths, I'm curious, what's the biggest or most common myth, that you hear when you're talking to people?
So my world is mostly alternative medicine, cash practices.
Okay.
So let's start with the definition. So telemedicine is simply medicine practiced remotely using electronic means.
So it
Each
is that
state will have
simple.
a slightly different, well, those are the three elements. Each state will have slightly different takes on it.
Mhm.
Some have expressly excluded telephone audio only calls, so that
Interesting.
brick and mortar clinics didn't get wrapped up in the telemedicine regulations, because often you have to call the patient and check on them, or so telephones have always been part of brick and mortar practices.
Okay.
Others now expressly include it as part of the practice of telemedicine
Mhm.
in their definition. So it is a state by state analysis, but if you just type in telemedicine laws at your state, you'll be able to
Mhm.
find the statute.
There you
If
go.
your state has a statute, we're here in 2023, and a couple of states still have nothing formally on the books. So it's kind of a newer
And if
field.
yours does, you might want to just kind of check in every, I don't know, twice a year or something, because something about it just seems to change.
Yeah, at least every July 1st, most states have their legislative sessions wrapped up by then, and
Okay.
laws will take effect by July 1st.
There you go. Okay. And then like a myth or two that you know, you find yourself dispelling more often than others, I guess.
Yeah, the biggest myths are, well, I don't take insurance, so it's not really medicine. That's false. So I gave you the definition of telemedicine.
Mhm.
Let's go into the definition of medicine.
Medicine,
So
yeah.
um, so the practice of medicine, again, is state specific, but essentially they're all very broad.
Mhm.
I go through two examples in my book. Maryland goes into great detail, trying to
Yeah.
include a lot of things. Florida goes into less detail, but the courts have interpreted it broadly.
Mhm.
But essentially, if you intend to diagnose, treat, cure, prevent illness, ailment, symptom, disease, condition, real or imagined, for pay or for free, um, and that's
Even for
essentially the practice
free.
of medicine, even sometimes for free.
Huh.
Um, Also, holding yourself out, which is a legal term of art, but representing yourself as doctor when you're not, can be interpreted as practicing medicine. So it's pretty broad, but ultimately, if you are giving clinical advice to an individual based on their individual kind of presentation to you,
Mhm.
it's likely to be considered clinical and practice of either medicine or your degree, if you're within the scope of your degree.
Got it. Okay. So there's the public service announcement.
Yeah,
Don't do any of those things unless you really mean to.
it's broader than you think. And
Yeah.
sometimes in my world, people are like, well, I only do lifestyle changes, or only recommend supplements, or I don't write prescriptions. And they think that that's not medicine. It is. It's still medicine.
Hmm.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
So with that as a backdrop, a couple of myths. I mean, are the myths, maybe did you just hit one of them? Well, I don't write a prescription, so it doesn't
Yeah,
apply to
that
me.
that was one. No prescriptions, no insurance. And then a very pervasive one is that you can just call yourself a health consultant and then practice anywhere you want. And that's not true at all. If you're doing what we just talked about, diagnose, treat, cure, prevent illness, ailment, symptom, disease, whether through prescriptions or not, whether through lifestyle interventions or not, it's likely medicine. So calling
So
it,
even if you're not licensed, I'm not licensed as a doctor. If I just start doing those things enough, could I trip into I'm now regulated as such?
if you started ordering tests on people and then interpreting those tests and then giving them, clinical advice, as which is what a
If
lot
I
of
could find a
health
lab to do that, I get, yeah.
Yeah, well, a lot of health coaching is the scope of a health coach is pretty limited, but a lot of health coaches illegally are doing all that stuff.
Okay.
And so at worst, they're stepping into the licensed profession of dietetics and nutritionists.
Hmm.
At well, I guess at best from a health coach standpoint. At worst, they're practicing medicine, ordering lab
Yeah.
tests, making protocols,
Yeah.
suggesting interventions.
Yeah.
So this kind of is on par with the call myself a consultant and do whatever I
Right.
want. Not true. In fact, practicing medicine without a license in a state where you're not licensed, or if you don't have any license, it carries criminal and civil liabilities, including jail time and hefty fines.
Yeah.
So
I bet you a lot of people
uh,
think, well, I don't have the license or I'm not writing prescriptions, so I'm fine.
yeah,
And
there's a lot of people out there doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Bet you we all know somebody. Um, hey, wait a second. Yeah. Um, so that's the first section. The next section of the book goes into, all right, let's talk about practicing telemedicine in the state in which you are licensed. Beefy chapter, but what do people need to know? Like, what's the essence that you think they need to know, the rest of which they can get when they read?
Yeah, the two biggest takeaways on this one are a lot of people want to do virtual only practices. So
Okay.
the two big questions are, can I establish care virtually? And
Mhm.
then are there any other things that would prevent me from practicing virtually only? Yes. So there are, and you can imagine the situations, but I'll give you a concrete example in a
Yeah.
second. There are situations where telemedicine is not appropriate.
Hmm.
So the general rule of thumb, and check with your state, but the general rule of thumb is if you can establish care, if you can meet the standard of care via telemedicine, then you can establish care and continue care via telemedicine only um, indefinitely if you can meet the standard of care.
Right.
One way it wouldn't meet the standard of care is if you broke your wrist and you came to me, your orthopedic surgeon, on Zoom and said, "Hey, I think I broke my wrist. Can you give it
Right.
a look?" No, I'd want to touch it. I'd want to make sure it's not a tendon or a ligament or a bone
Right.
or a muscle, something like that. So
Right.
that would necessitate an in-person visit. So that wouldn't be appropriate. The other consideration for virtual only practices are controlled substance prescribing.
Yeah. Talk more. I was reading about this, and I'll admit I got a little lost in it. But so go into it.
Okay, yeah, it is a
Yeah.
little
So
bit
clear it
deep.
up. Yeah. Yeah. It's necessarily so, but yeah.
Yeah, here's the rule. Before you can prescribe controlled substance, you have to see them in person.
Okay.
That's the rule. It's a long chapter. There's a lot of nuance
That's
to it, but
yeah.
ultimately, it's sort of, and I made it short on purpose. You're welcome. It's the main body of the book's about 85 pages long.
Mm.
Um, and but this chapter needed a lot of explaining.
Yeah.
So in 2008, the Ryan-Haidt Act started to regulate online prescribing, and they were trying to prevent opioids being just kind of dished out over the internet. Congress directed the DEA to come up with a telemedicine kind of registration that legitimate like providers could do to register and prescribe via telemedicine
Yeah.
controlled substances. They
Mhm.
haven't done it. It's 15 years later. They still haven't done it, even after a 2018 law directing them to do it. So two different congressional laws have directed them to do it. They haven't done it. Now we are, as we record this, it's almost the end of the public health emergency.
Yeah.
The DEA has come out with some limited rules on how you can kind of maybe prescribe via telemedicine, but it's limited to 30 days total. And then after that, you have to see the patient in person. So ultimately, the takeaway from that whole chapter is before you can prescribe controlled substance, you have to see them in person.
Yeah.
Unless you've established care, you can write up to 30 days, but you have to be checking the practitioner database in each state if they have it for controlled
Yeah.
substance prescribing.
Yeah.
So there are a few more nuances to that kind of temporary, not temporary, but the new rule that the DEA just came out with.
Okay.
And the worst part is DEA has come out and said that these two kind of temporary rules, not temporary, but they're newer, satisfy their requirement to kind of make a path for legitimate providers to register and prescribe via telemedicine. So the long and the short of it is, for prescribing controlled substances, you have to see the patient in person.
You have to see him in person. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, not controlled substances issue, but just so you gave an example of very extreme example. If your arm is broken, obviously you have to go in. And if you are something where it's just a conversation and that's the nature of standard of care, obviously you don't. I'm wondering what you're seeing with what I'll call hybrid. So I had an example. This was 5 or 6 years ago. I had to go to an allergist. I had an explosion and I had to go. And so I went in for all the testing. It made sense. And then and this is pre-COVID, pre-everything. Um, at 4 weeks, my prescription's refilled. And then at 6 weeks, she wanted to see me again. So, and there's this app that we can communicate through. And so at 4 weeks, I um, I text her through the app. Can you call in the refills? And we start a conversation. Oh, I feel really good. And none of this occurs to me without, and we go back and forth in real time. And then towards the end of it, 10 or 15 minutes later, it hits me. I wonder if I have to go back at all. I mean, I feel really good. The prescriptions are getting filled. So I sent that in. Do you need to see me in 2 weeks at all? pregnant pause from her. And she comes back, she says, well, I guess not, but please make an appointment in the future. And I said to myself, oh, she should have gotten paid for that. That was the visit. There would have been nothing else that was done. She was just checking in. She got nothing. And to me, my own term is a hybrid, right? Because same patient, two different types of appointments. Are you, when I throw that at you, what's your, because I can imagine a lot of practices have, your wife probably has, there's times you got to come in and examine, and then there's follow-ups, maybe not, but there's a lot of, it seems to me, where that's the case, or that's the nature of standard of care.
So you were
And they're
messaging
trapped.
it in an app?
Well, or instead of the app, couldn't we have had a Zoom? Couldn't have been set up where it's like, what, just call me, and I've had a few others where we've done the follow-up, but man, it's like, it's hard to schedule and nobody's really sure. You don't know in advance. And so then, so I got what I wanted. She got screwed.
Yeah.
And she was just very nice at doing, she should have gotten compensated for it. So, you know what I mean?
Yeah, a couple of things kind of jump out at me there. So that chat-based interaction you have with her is also telemedicine. So it's a subset called asynchronous telemedicine, meaning you send a text. She can think for as long as she wants. It's not live in real time. You guys happen to be both on the chat at the same time, but it's still kind of back and forth.
It actually was asynchronous. It was just, she just happened, I guess she was just there and replying.
Yeah. Yeah. So things like email or text message are forms of asynchronous communications, though I wouldn't use either of those unless they're in like a HIPAA compliant,
Sure.
EMR.
Yeah.
But so that's one thing that jumped out. Yeah. And a lot of times fee-for-service practices don't get compensated for those in-between encounters. And so that's a large part of the reason why for kind of longer term interventions like lifestyle medicine, that functional and integrative medicine is, programs and memberships make a lot more sense because there's a lot more hand-holding in between. And so in my wife's practice, she gets essentially compensated for that with the payment structure we have put in place. And then, yeah, another thing I wrote down while you were kind of going through that scenario is that insurance rates may be different. And so depending on in-person visits or telemedicine visits, and then those are called parity rules.
I'm hearing whispers of that. I'm in Illinois. I'm hearing whispers of that from a couple of my clients, and you got to be kidding me. It's stupid.
Yeah. So there's two types of parity. So if you're in the insurance world, there is coverage parity, meaning sometimes there's a law that means the insurance companies must cover the same visit, whether it's in person or at home via telemedicine. And then there's service parity. I might even have these phrases mixed up because I don't deal with insurance every day. But yes, so they are mixed up. Yeah. So check out the book. The other type of parity is basically compensation parity, meaning the reimbursement that the doctor's office receives is the same, whether it's in person or telemedicine. So those aren't always the case. Not every state has any parity at all. Some have one, but not the other. They would usually have coverage parity, but not service parity, or vice versa. I forget the phrases there. Where it must be covered, but it may not have to be covered at the same rate.
Yeah.
So that's another kind of thing that jumped out to me when you were describing your interaction with your doctor.
Yeah. And so another client, they're like, because I was asking about, what about telemedicine? Should we talk about that more in our marketing? Yeah, not so much, because the coverage is like half of the same visit if it were in person versus tele. It's so unfortunate. So much. If it's clinically appropriate, why not? It's easier on everybody. And anyway, yeah. But know the rule, know the definitions, know what's going on. Cool. And then the last part of your book goes into, all right, now you want to start, what about practicing across state lines? So you live in one state, obviously you practice in one state, you might be regional or national, whatever it is. It just seems like it gets even more complicated. Of course, it's doable. It's just there's more to know. So break that down for us, kind of give us the intro to that.
Yeah, practicing across state lines, the number one takeaway is you must be licensed where the patient is located, because where the patient is located is where the visit is being deemed to occur. And that is consistent across every state.
Okay.
I get a lot of people that are like, I want to practice across the whole country. I have Instagram followers that reach out to me all the time. And there is a path to do it, and I outline it in the book. There's several paths to do it, some of which are easier than others. But as we talked about earlier, if you're accepting patients from other states and you're not licensed there, that's a crime essentially.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you get caught, it is a crime, whether you get caught or not.
Right.
But not only is it, against the law, but your malpractice may not cover you in other states. So say
Right.
you accept a patient from Washington state and you end up harming them in some way.
Mhm.
Now they have put a complaint to the Washington Medical Board, and your malpractice will not help you with that, either to defend it or to pay any settlements or judgments against you. So there's people in my kind of niche are like, well, it's low risk medicine, it's fine. Well, there's still
Off you
lawsuits,
go, man. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I say my spiel all the time, because I have this conversation 3 or 4 times a week. But I say ultimately it's up to your risk tolerance. So,
Yeah.
I was just reading that Vanderbilt with all his railroads was breaking the law every time he signed a new contract, and he was just
Really?
like, "Who cares? I've got all the power. It doesn't matter."
Yeah.
But if you don't have Vanderbilt's power, then you might want to follow the rules more. But I say all that to say, it's up to your risk tolerance.
Mhm.
It's your license. You paid a lot of money for it.
Yeah.
A disciplinary kind of ding on your license sticks around for a long time,
Mhm.
prevents you from getting licensed in other states. And so there are now, as of the end of 2022, and I prefaced it that way because the legislatures around the country are getting together right now in the spring of 2023.
Yeah.
But as of the end of 2022, there are 16 states that allow you to have a telemedicine only registration or license. What that means is, in the most liberal version of that, is
Mhm.
you just register with the Department of Health. And I'm thinking of Florida now. The
Mhm.
policymakers call it the Florida model. You register with the Florida Department of Health. You send them your license verification from your home state. And then within usually 48 hours, some of my clients have said it takes just 2 days. You can start practicing in Florida. There's really no limitations other than you can't come down and see people in person in Florida.
Okay.
So from out of state, you can practice following standard of care.
Mhm.
And that's it. Florida doesn't charge you any money for it. Now you may have
Oh,
to pay your licensing agency to kind of send the records over,
sure.
but it doesn't cost $1 in Florida yet. Other states, so there's 15 more that have a similar program. Some of them have more restrictions on what you can and can't do in
Mhm.
that state. But I've laid out step by step how to do it for each of those states in the book.
Mhm.
And there will be updates to it because 4 years ago, there were just 9 states.
Mhm.
Now there are 16. I imagine more will come because last summer, 2022, the Uniform Law Commission, which is just a bunch of people that make recommendations to make laws kind of uniform across the country, they adopted, kind of passed, basically recommended the Florida model to every state around the country. So
Okay.
between that special telemedicine registration or license, sometimes it's called, and interstate medical licensure compacts, which go from MD and DO all the way down to kind of PTs.
Mhm.
There's no reason why you can't get a license in a state where you want to be licensed. That one
Just
covers the
do the work.
MDDO version of that covers 39 states.
Right.
So
So just do the work. Yeah. Who's the
ultimately,
most restrictive state, at least as of right now, would you say,
for
for being able to practice? You live in state one.
from
You
out
live
of state,
from out of state. Yeah. I was blanking on that.
yeah, many of them. So there are 11 that are not part of that compact. California is probably one, and
Okay.
Texas is probably the other. Florida is shocking because typically we're very restrictive, at least for lawyers. We don't reciprocate with any other
Okay.
bar associations. But it seems like pretty open for that one. But California is, you need a full license there. Many of the other states, you'll need a full license. And that's where either the interstate medical licensure compact will come through, or you can just apply directly. You go through the whole application process. then you get a full license there.
Got
Now,
it.
people want to practice around the country without having to go through all that stuff just because they don't like it and they don't want to. But that's the right way to do it.
Hmm.
I'm sorry that you have to either focus your marketing in your state or states of
Hmm.
licensure. And I actually even cover it in the book, and I recommend this all the time. Just start creating like a course or a book yourself that you can offer these people. I
Yep.
know you're unique and you're the best one in your field, that everybody from around the world should come see you.
Yeah.
But there's
Well, then
probably
write it
someone in
down
your
and tell them, get
community.
them to buy
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. You can still impart your knowledge and have impact and do all that through publishing
Right.
educational materials.
Right. Right. Which is one area that we didn't get into, just in the interest of kind of time, right? Because we could talk a lot about this, but also in the
Yeah.
interest of time, a couple of closing questions I ask every guest. The first one is there anything you think I should have asked you, but just did not in the context of what we talked about?
I did think we covered it all.
Well,
Yeah,
that's a valid answer.
the last thing is specifically for controlled substances. As you go around getting your licenses in these other states,
Mhm.
even though your DEA registration is nominally a federal registration, each state may require you to register as a DEA prescriber in that state as well. So you didn't ask me about that, so I
Mm,
thought I'd throw that in there.
perfect. Okay. And then the other wrap up question is, so we've caught a listener's attention. They've been thinking about starting or adding telemedicine. And right when they're done listening, where should they start? What would you recommend they do? Something tangible they could just do, you know?
Um, well, find an EMR or purchase the HIPAA compliant version of video conferencing from Zoom. Has one for healthcare.
Okay.
I'm sure there are others out there, like Doxy is another company that does it too. Find one of those, get
Hmm.
a telemedicine consent in place. I have a template at Functional Lawyer, or maybe call your malpractice carrier for one.
Hmm.
And then, make sure that your visits will meet the standard of care. And then if
Hmm.
you take insurance, you may want to call your in-network insurance providers and ask them what the codes are, what the reimbursement rates are
Right.
for the visits you're trying to have.
Right. Figure out where you're licensed. Make sure
Yeah.
you're asking people what state they're in.
Yeah. I mean, it gets tricky. People are like, well, what happens when they go on vacation? And this is all sort
Yeah.
of gray zone stuff where you can kind of try to limit your risk. I mean, those once in a while things are okay.
Mm.
But if you're building your practice, and I often give the example, if you're on the border of like Ohio and Kentucky, and 45% of your patients come from the other state,
Hmm.
you probably want to get licensed in the other state, right?
Right. Right.
Or if a significant subset of your patients are coming from out of state, you may want to, look at those states strategically. And if it's, 2 or 3, just get those 2 or 3 licenses. You don't need 52, although
Yeah. You've
I
already
know
got a
doctors with
following.
52 licenses.
Yeah.
But you definitely don't need all 52 licenses.
Yeah. 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 And if you've got a following in the other state, why wouldn't you do it anyway?
Sure.
Makes a lot of sense. Cool.
Mhm.
Well, Scott, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on, shedding a little bit of light on this topic. It is old to say that it is a new topic or a hot topic, but it is definitely evolving, definitely changing rapidly. And if you're thinking of getting into this, you need to have your finger on the pulse in some way. And Scott, as a resource, I think is a good way to do that. So thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. Yeah, it's a very
Yeah,
young area of the law.
it
The law typically moves slowly. This is moving really fast. So it's
pretty
just trying to
fast.
catch up to the industry.
Right, which doesn't always make it better, but it's faster.
Right.
Yeah. So Scott Rattigan is with Functional Lawyer. You can find him on scottrattigan.com. We'll put all the contact information that you supplied in the show notes, as long as a link to your book. And a couple of other points before we wrap up for the day. First, if you're someone like Scott or I that serves private practice owners, or if you are a private practice owner yourself, and either way, you've got some experience that you think private practice owners would benefit from, we really want you to come on PracticeCare and talk about it. In the show notes for Scott's episode and every episode, there's a link, a couple of questions, tell us what's on your mind so that we can get you scheduled as soon as possible. And finally, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to PracticeCare on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Amazon, wherever you go. We are there, all the major platforms. Subscribe so that you can keep up with new episodes. Thanks very much, and until next time.